The Passover table your grandmother set was not the Passover table you set. Not because she had more time, not because she was more devoted, because she knew things that nobody thought to teach you, and the knowing of those things produced a table so specific and so complete that the people who sat at it understood, without being told, exactly where they were and exactly who they were and exactly what the night meant. You are setting a different table. You do not know what is missing from it. That is the most complete form of loss there is. The loss you cannot measure because you never knew what you had. 15 dishes, all of them standard on American Jewish holiday tables between 1940 and 1965. None of them on yours. We are going to recover them, not as museum pieces, not as nostalgia objects, but as living preparations that you can make this year for the holiday that is coming, at the table where the people you love will sit and eat and understand, perhaps for the first time, what those tables were actually doing beyond feeding people. This channel exists because the things worth saving are almost never saved by the institutions that should save them. They are saved by individuals who refuse to accept that gone means gone forever. Subscribe now and become one of those individuals. What you learn here belongs on your table, not in a history book. In 1948, the average American Jewish household observing the high holidays prepared between 8 and 12 dishes specific to those holidays, preparations that did not appear on any other day of the year, that announced the season by their presence on the stove and their smell in the apartment, that had been made the same way by the same woman for 30 years, and that her daughter was expected to learn by watching, and did not always learn because watching and learning are not the same thing. The WPA documentation of Jewish immigrant food culture in the late 1930s captures a holiday food system of extraordinary specificity. Dishes tied not just to the holiday, but to the week of the holiday, to the day within the week, to the specific moment in the holiday meal when they appeared. The tzimmes came after the soup and before the meat, always, because the sweetness of the tzimmes was a transition, a preparation of the palate for what followed. The honey cake appeared at the end of the Rosh Hashanah meal and was eaten with tea, never with coffee, because the honey and the tea were a combination that the tradition had refined over generations into something that worked, and coffee did not work with honey cake in the same way. And the people who knew this knew it the way they knew which prayers came in which order, not as a choice, but as the way things were. Ted Merwin, in his documentation of the American Jewish deli, describes the holiday food of the immigrant household as the most resistant to Americanization of all the cuisine's components. The weekday food assimilated faster, became more American, incorporated more convenience products, while the holiday food held its ground longer because it was tied to observance rather than convenience, and because the women who made it understood, even when they could not articulate it, that changing the holiday food was changing the holiday itself. The resistance did not hold forever. The second generation made substitutions that seemed minor and were not. The third generation made substitutions on top of substitutions and called the result tradition. The fourth generation bought prepared food from a kosher caterer and called that tradition too. At each step, something specific was lost, and something general was retained, and the general thing that was retained carried the name of the specific thing that was lost, which is how a honey cake made with vegetable oil and baking powder comes to sit on a Rosh Hashanah table alongside honey cake made with schmaltz and hand-beaten eggs, and be called by the same name, indistinguishably, as if they were the same thing. They are not the same thing. This video is going to show you the difference, dish by dish, and it is going to give you enough to bring the specific thing back to your table this year. Stay with us through item 13. What you hear there about why the stuffed preparations disappeared from holiday tables in the 1960s will change the way you understand every holiday meal you have eaten since. Parsnip tzimmes, not the carrot tzimmes that became the standard, not the sweet potato version that the post-war American Jewish kitchen normalized, but the original root vegetable preparation that used parsnip as its primary ingredient, a choice that produced a tzimmes of specific complexity that carrot cannot replicate. The parsnip, which carries a natural pepperiness beneath its sweetness, a flavor note that carrot doesn't possess, when braised long and slow with prunes, a small amount of honey, lemon juice, and rendered chicken fat, produced a dish in which the sweetness and the sharpness worked against each other across the full duration of the braise, with the sweetness winning slowly as the parsnip softened and the prune dissolved, and the honey thickened the braising liquid into a glaze. At dozens of delis serving holiday takeout food in the Bronx and Brooklyn in the late 1940s and early 1950s, parsnip tzimmes was available in the 2 weeks before Rosh Hashanah as a prepared dish sold by weight. The price at Feinberg's on East Tremont Avenue was 11 cents per quarter pound in 1951. The dish required parsnips of a specific maturity, not the thin, young parsnips available in early summer, but the thick, starchy autumn parsnips that the root vegetable produces after the first frost has converted some of its starch to sugar, a conversion that makes the vegetable a different ingredient from its summer self. The delis that made parsnip tzimmes understood the seasonal specificity of the ingredient because their cooks had been making it long enough to know the difference between an early parsnip and a frost-touched one. When the post-war supermarket normalized parsnip availability year-round through refrigerated storage and out-of-season sourcing, the distinction between the seasonal ingredient and the year-round commodity became invisible, and the cooks who inherited the recipe without inheriting the seasonal knowledge produced a tzimmes that was technically correct and specifically wrong, and the customers who ate it and found it slightly less complex than they remembered blamed their own memory rather than the parsnip. Stuffed veal breast for Shabbat, the preparation that appeared on Friday night tables in Jewish households from the 1920s through the early 1960s, and that has since disappeared so completely that most American Jews born after 1965 have never encountered it in any context. The veal breast, a cut with a natural pocket formed between the layers of meat and fat and the rib bones beneath, was filled with a stuffing of bread soaked in water and squeezed dry, mixed with sautéed onion, egg, parsley, salt, pepper, and a specific amount of paprika that varied by household, but that was always present, then sewn or skewered closed and roasted in a covered pan with onion and a small amount of water or white wine for 2.5 to 3 hours, at a temperature low enough that the veal remained moist throughout. What emerged was a self-contained preparation, the stuffing having absorbed the fat and juice of the veal during the roasting, the veal having taken on the flavor of the stuffing from the inside, the two becoming interdependent in a way that produced something neither could have been separately. At Rosen's kosher delicatessen on the Grand Concourse, stuffed veal breast was available as a Friday takeout item through the late 1950s at 65 cents per portion, and the portions were large enough that a family of 4 could be fed from a single piece, with enough left for Saturday lunch. The dish required a veal breast from a kosher butcher who knew how to prepare the pocket, a cut that required skill to execute without piercing the outer layer and losing the structural integrity that the pocket required. As the kosher butcher trade contracted in the late 1950s and early 1960s, with the retirement of first-generation immigrant butchers and the insufficient replacement of their skills by the next generation, the availability of correctly prepared veal breast declined. By 1965, it had become difficult to source in most New York neighborhoods. By 1975, it was largely unavailable. The dish did not lose its customers. It lost its ingredient upstream, invisibly, through the attrition of a skilled trade that nobody had prioritized preserving. Honey cake, lekach, the original, made with schmaltz. Not the version made with oil, which produces a moist but one-dimensional crumb. Not the version made with butter, which is not kosher for the meat-eating household, and represents a theological compromise the immigrant baker would not have accepted. The schmaltz version, made with rendered chicken fat in the place of every other fat in the recipe, produced a crumb of specific tenderness and a flavor of specific depth that neither oil nor butter can replicate, because schmaltz carries the flavor of the onion and the animal that produced it. and that flavor, present in a quantity too small to identify as schmaltz by anyone who did not know it was there, added a savory undertone to the cake's sweetness that prevented the honey from becoming cloying, and that gave the cake a complexity in the back of the palate that oil-based versions do not possess. The recipe also used strong brewed coffee as the liquid component, not water, not juice, but coffee, which contributed a bitterness that balanced the honey's sweetness and a color that produced the cake's characteristic dark crumb. At Moish's bakery on 2nd Avenue, the schmaltz lekach made for Rosh Hashanah was available, beginning 2 weeks before the holiday, and sold in whole loaves for 40 cents, or by the slice for 5 cents. The baker who made it had been adjusting the recipe for American ingredients since 1931, American honey being less complex than the European varieties he had used before immigration, American flour absorbing liquid differently than the flour he had learned with. And those adjustments, accumulated over decades, lived in his hands, rather than in the recipe he kept in a notebook in his apron pocket. The notebook survived him. The adjustments did not. What connects parsnip tzimmes, stuffed veal breast, and schmaltz honey cake is not that they were difficult to make. They were not more difficult than what replaced them. What connects them is that each one required a specific human being who had made it enough times to know something that the recipe did not say. The frost-touched parsnip, the correctly prepared pocket, the adjustment for American honey. And when those human beings were no longer in the kitchen, the recipes they left behind were insufficient to reproduce what they had made. The recipes were the skeleton. The knowledge was the flesh. The skeleton survived. The flesh did not. This is the mechanism by which the second generation's holiday table became a diminished version of the first generation's holiday table without anyone deciding to diminish it. Nobody chose to make a worse tzimmes. They made the tzimmes the recipe described, and the recipe described a dish that required knowledge the recipe could not contain, and the gap between the recipe and the knowledge is exactly the size of what was lost. If your grandmother made a holiday dish that you have never been able to find a recipe for, subscribe and leave the name of that dish in the comments right now, not the recipe, the name, and the holiday it belonged to. This channel is assembling the last inventory of what those tables held, and your comment is an entry in that inventory that belongs nowhere else. Rosel fleisch, the cold pickled beef that appeared on Ashkenazi holiday tables as an appetizer or a first course, and that has now disappeared so completely from American Jewish food culture that even the name is unfamiliar to most people under 60. The preparation: a brisket or a piece of beef plate, cured in a brine of salt, garlic, bay leaf, black pepper, and a small amount of vinegar for a minimum of 5 days, and sometimes as long as 10. Then simmered in fresh water with onion and root vegetables until fork tender, then pressed between weighted boards while still warm and refrigerated overnight, producing a firm, sliceable cold meat of intense flavor and specific texture. Not corned beef, which uses a different brine and a different cut. Not pastrami, which is smoked, but a cold, pickled beef that occupied a category entirely its own, served thin-sliced with strong horseradish and rye bread at the beginning of the holiday meal, before the soup as the thing that announced the meal's seriousness. It appeared on Passover tables, on Rosh Hashanah tables, on Shavuot tables. At several Lower East Side delis in the 1930s and 40s, Rosel fleisch was prepared specifically for the holiday period and sold by the pound from the cold case. The 5 to 10 day cure required a refrigerator large enough to hold the brine vessel and a household willing to commit the space, which became less common as post-war apartments were designed with smaller kitchens and smaller refrigerators optimized for the convenience foods that were supposed to make the long preparations unnecessary. The dish was not replaced by a better dish. It was replaced by an assumption that the long preparation was no longer worth the space it required, and the assumption became a habit, and the habit became a generation that had never tasted the thing the assumption had eliminated. Apple and honey cake for Rosh Hashanah, the specific combination preparation. Not the apple cake, and not the honey cake, but the cake in which fresh apple was folded into the honey cake batter in a way that produced a different result from either cake made separately. The apple, peeled, cored, grated on the coarse side of the grater, then squeezed in a cloth to remove the excess moisture before being added to the batter, contributed both flavor and texture, its slight acidity cutting the honey's sweetness, and its fiber providing a resistance to the crumb that neither an apple-free honey cake nor an apple cake without honey possesses. The preparation required the grating and squeezing as a preliminary step that took 20 minutes and that most post-war recipes eliminated in favor of simply dicing the apple and folding it in directly. A shortcut that produced a wetter batter and a gummy crumb and a cake that was specifically not what the original had been. At the bakeries that supplied Jewish households in Brooklyn and the Bronx with holiday cakes in the 1940s and 50s, the apple honey cake was made with the grating step, because the bakers who made it had learned it with the grating step and understood, from having made it both ways, that the step mattered. When those bakers retired and the recipes they had used were passed to successors who had not made both versions and could not compare them, the shortcut became the recipe, and the recipe became the standard, and the standard became the thing that was served at Rosh Hashanah and called traditional. And it was traditional in the sense that it had been made for 40 years, but it was not traditional in the sense that it was the thing that the tradition had originally produced. Stuffed derma for Passover, the version prepared specifically for the holiday, which differed from the year-round deli preparation in its use of matzo meal rather than flour in the filling, a substitution required by the prohibition on leavened grain during Passover that produced not a compromise, but a different and in some ways superior preparation. The matzo meal filling absorbed the schmaltz differently than the flour filling, less completely, retaining a slight graininess that gave the stuffed casing a texture neither the flour version nor any modern preparation achieves. The Passover stuffed derma was, for the households that made it, the version eaten once a year that could not be eaten any other time, which gave it the specific quality of holiday food that is inseparable from its scarcity, the thing that is good partly because it is rare, that arrives with the holiday and departs with it, that marks the time of year as definitively as the date on the calendar. When the preparation of stuffed derma declined in the post-war years, for the reasons already documented in previous videos on this channel, the USDA regulations of 1967, the retirement of the kosher butchers who had prepared the casings, the Passover version declined with it, and the holiday table lost not just a dish but a marker of the season, one of the specific things that had made Passover feel like Passover rather than a Friday night with more courses. Leave one memory in the comments right now, not a recipe request. A memory, the dish, the holiday, the person who made it, and one detail about the making that you have never forgotten. The smell, the sound, the specific bowl it was served in. One detail. This comment section is the archive that the cookbooks missed. Every detail left here is a detail that may allow someone else to recognize something they had half forgotten and bring it back to their own table. Leave it now, before the video moves you past the moment. Kasha varnishkes for Yom Kippur break fast, not as a year-round side dish, which is how it survived in diminished form, but as the specific preparation made for the break-fast meal eaten after the Yom Kippur fast ended, which differed from the year-round version in its seasoning and its schmaltz content. The break-fast version used a higher quantity of caramelized onion cooked slowly in schmaltz for 45 minutes rather than the 15-minute sauté of the weekday preparation, onion taken to a depth of color and sweetness that the quick version cannot achieve, and added a specific amount of black pepper and a small amount of chicken broth to the finished dish, which gave it a moisture and a richness absent from the drier year-round preparation. The logic was physiological as much as culinary. A person who has fasted for 25 hours requires food that is immediately nourishing and immediately comforting. And the breakfast Kasha varnishkes, with its generous schmaltz and its deeply caramelized onion and its warmth from the black pepper, was designed for that specific body in that specific state. The preparation of this dish was a Friday afternoon task, made in advance of the fast, reheated after it ended, and the woman who made it had calibrated the schmaltz quantity and the onion's depth of color to the specific needs of the break-fast moment over years of making it and watching her family eat it and adjusting. When she was gone and her daughter made the recipe she had left, the recipe described a Kasha varnishkes, but not the break-fast Kasha varnishkes, because the recipe could not describe the calibration, and the calibration was the difference. Nahit, roasted chickpeas, prepared for Simchat Torah in a specific way that American Jewish households practiced through the 1950s, and that has since been replaced entirely by the commercial roasted chickpea snack available from any grocery store. The preparation: dried chickpeas soaked overnight, drained, tossed with a small amount of schmaltz and coarse salt, spread on a baking sheet, and roasted in a moderate oven for 45 minutes to an hour, removed when the exterior had gone hard and the interior was still slightly yielding rather than completely desiccated, salted again immediately while hot. The result was a specific texture, a resistance at the tooth that gave way to a center that retained the chickpea's essential character, which the commercial product's uniform crunchiness eliminates entirely, and a flavor that the schmaltz had carried into the legume during the roasting, producing a savory depth that the olive oil of the commercial version does not replicate. Nahit appeared on Simchat Torah because the holiday involved children, and children eating Nahit while the Torah scrolls were carried around the synagogue was a specific sensory memory of that holiday for every Jewish child who experienced it between 1920 and 1960. When the community that had practiced this dispersed from its neighborhoods in the late 1950s and early 1960s, the holiday practice that had been sustained by that community's density and continuity became difficult to maintain in the suburban synagogue, where children did not know each other as well, and the holiday had fewer of the informal neighborhood traditions that had given it texture. The Nahit continued in some households for another decade. Then it stopped, and the stopping was so gradual that nobody marked the last time. Farfel soup for Passover. The broken matzo farfel, toasted in a dry pan until golden and smelling of grain, then added to chicken broth enriched with schmaltz and seasoned with a small amount of ginger, served as the first course of the Passover Seder in households that had maintained the tradition of the toasted farfel, rather than adopting the matzo ball as the Passover soup standard. The matzo ball won the competition for the Passover soup course because it was more dramatic, larger, more visually impressive, a more obvious demonstration of the cook's skill. The farfel soup was modest. The toasted grain floated in the broth and softened slowly during eating, and the flavor of the toast came through the broth in a way that enriched rather than dominated, and the ginger, present in an amount calibrated to warm rather than spice, made the soup a specific thing rather than a general thing. It was specific to Passover because farfel is specific to Passover, and it was specific to households that understood the toasting step, and it was lost when those households stopped making it, and the matzo ball became the universal standard, and the farfel soup became a preparation that existed only in the memory of people who had eaten it at a specific table, in a specific apartment, in a specific city, in a specific decade that is now 60 years past. What you are about to hear is the dish this entire video was constructed around, the one that represents the most complete form of holiday food loss, the one that was not just a preparation but a technology, and whose disappearance changed the character of the holiday itself. Stuffed chicken neck, Helzel, for the Sabbath and holiday table. Not as a deli item, as which it has been documented elsewhere, but as the home preparation that appeared on Friday night Shabbat tables and on holiday tables across the Jewish neighborhoods of New York from the immigration period through the early 1960s, made in the home kitchen by women who had learned it from their mothers and who understood it not as a special occasion dish, but as a standard component of the Shabbat meal, as expected and as unremarkable as the soup that preceded it and the fruit compote that followed it. The preparation: the neck skin of a chicken or goose, removed in one unbroken piece with a knife kept specifically for this purpose, rubbed with a small amount of salt to firm the skin, stuffed with a mixture of flour, schmaltz, grated onion, paprika, salt, and pepper that had been worked together by hand until it cohered, tied at both ends with kitchen string, and added to the coolant, the long braising Sabbath stew, on Friday afternoon to cook overnight. What emerged on Saturday morning, when the coolant was opened, was a dense, yielding cylinder of stuffed skin that had spent 12 to 16 hours absorbing the flavors of everything that had simmered around it: the beef, the beans, the potato, the onion, while contributing its own rendered fat and seasoning back to the stew. A woman named Chana Blum made Helzel every Friday from 1932 until 1971 in her apartment on East Tremont Avenue in the Bronx. She made it for her husband, her 4 children, and, as the family grew, for the grandchildren who came for Shabbat lunch. She made it from a technique she had learned from her mother in Vilna, adjusted for American chicken skin, which is thinner than the goose skin the original preparation had used, and required a shorter filling to prevent bursting. The adjustment, a reduction in filling quantity that she had arrived at through trial and error in her first years in America, lived in her hands, not in any instruction she ever gave. Her daughters watched her make Helzel for 40 years. Not one of them learned to make it. They had watched. They had not learned. Watching and learning, as this channel has said before, are not the same thing. Chana Blum died in 1974, 3 years after she stopped making Helzel, when her hands became unreliable and she could no longer trust them to remove the neck skin without tearing it. The last Helzel she made was eaten on a Saturday in October of 1971 by people who did not know it was the last one. Nobody said anything about it. Nobody knew there was anything to say. If there is a dish that appeared on your family's holiday table and that you have never found a recipe for, not because the recipe does not exist somewhere, but because the recipe you would need is the one that Chana Blum carried in her hands, come back to this channel. Leave the dish in the comments. Describe what you remember of it, however imperfectly, however partially. This channel does not promise to recover everything. It promises to try, which is more than the institutions that were supposed to preserve these things ever did. Your comment is the beginning of the recovery, not the end of it. Compote, the fruit compote that ended the holiday meal, the Shabbat meal, the weeknight meal in the winter months when fresh fruit was expensive and dried fruit was what the kitchen had. Not a dessert in the modern sense. A ritual conclusion: prunes, apricots, raisins, a piece of dried fig if the budget allowed, simmered in water with a cinnamon stick and a strip of lemon peel, and a very small amount of sugar, served warm in the bowl with the cooking liquid, eaten slowly after the main course while the conversation continued and the tea was prepared. The compote required nothing except time and the understanding that dried fruit, given enough simmering and enough resting in its liquid, produces a flavor more complex than its ingredients suggest. The prune releasing its tannin into the liquid, the apricot contributing its acidity, the cinnamon threading through everything without dominating, the lemon peel providing a brightness at the finish that prevented the whole thing from becoming heavy. Every woman who made it the same way and made it differently, the variations being in the ratio of fruits and the length of the simmer and the amount of sugar, which was always small because the fruit's own sweetness was the point. It appeared on holiday tables as the final course not because it was impressive, but because it was right. Because a meal that had begun with schmaltz and proceeded through meat required an ending that was light and slightly acidic and cleansing, and the compote provided that ending with the simplicity of something that had been providing it for generations. It disappeared from American Jewish tables in the 1960s when the category of dessert, imported from American food culture, demanded something more impressive: a cake, a cookie, a purchased item in a box. And the compote, which was neither impressive nor purchasable, was replaced by things that were both and that ended the meal on a note of sweetness that left the palate heavier rather than cleaner, which is a different ending and a different kind of meal. Make one dish from this list for the next holiday. Not all 15. 1. The parsnip tzimmes, if the holiday is Rosh Hashanah and you can find autumn parsnips. The The Farfel soup, if the holiday is Passover and you have matzo in the house. The compote, if the holiday is any of them, because the compote requires nothing except dried fruit and thyme, and the willingness to end the meal quietly rather than impressively. Make it this year at your table for the people who will sit at your table. Tell them what it is, and where it comes from, and why it disappeared, and why you are making it anyway. Then come back to this comment section and tell us what happened at the table when you served it. Not whether it was right, not whether it tasted exactly as you imagined it should, but what happened in the room when a dish appeared that had not been at that table in 60 years. What happens in the room is the point. The room is what the holiday was always for. The dish is how the room knows what kind of night it is. Bring the dish back. Let the room know.